Thank you very much. And I feel almost embarrassed when Priya read that I haven't been here in over 2 decades, right? But it's because I like Calgary. It's a great city. And boy, has it ever changed. One thing I will tell you is that coming across the border, because I've been living in the United States for about, 13 years now, count your blessings. You're living on this side of the 49th parallel. Okay. And I think the theme of this conference is very apt because if you've kept up to date in terms of I'll just put it mildly, the shenanigans in terms of memory, the erasure of diversity initiatives, including the chapters on diversity that are so crucial to the bettering of American society, that's all in question right now. So it's a very apt subject. The presentation that I'm going to give is going to be slightly experimental. It's going to be in 2 parts. The first part, I'm going to show you quite a few examples of public art to discuss. And by showing you several examples, I hope to illustrate the breadth and complexity of public art, and especially in its relationship to historical memory. And by no means do I claim that these examples cover all the issues related to public art. Far from it. In the second section, I will share my top personal secrets to success in the public art world. I'm being a little bit facetious, but I'm going to share you my 10 rules to public art for anyone who's interested in learning about and engaging with public art. And these 10 rules are things that I don't announce them as prescription for you, but just things that I've thought about and that I consider important for me and my own work. So let's review what public art is. First of all, public art is created for and placed in a public space, and it's often seen as a public good. However, the question of how truly public a public realm is can be complicated. So, for example, there's a public space crisis that has been rendered, well, especially stark, especially during the pandemic, but also worsened by the encroachment, territorialization of privatization, and the increasing over-administration in many cases, of genuine public space. When I say administration, I'm referring to bureaucratic oversight and policing and surveillance of public space. And by genuine public space, I'm referring to spatial areas that permit diverse spatial practices and encourage ongoing public conversations. It can't just be one. It has to be ongoing and generative of more conversations. For example, in the 1990s, there was a major debate in Toronto City Hall about the problems facing the downtown stretch of Yonge Street near Dundas. This area, it was deemed by city burghers, needed revitalization. Why? Because the stores were considered seedy, and that discouraged people from visiting. One councillor famously said, "Nobody goes there." But that wasn't true. Anyone who went to Yonge Street at that time, and I did, would know it was always full of people. Downtown Yonge Street was full of young people, punks, goth, mods, rockers, skinheads, grunge types, but it wasn't empty. And a lot of the stores, of course, would cater to them, and a lot of teenagers hung out there. What's that to say? So it was lively and far from empty. And later on in this talk, I'm going to show you the example of downtown St. Louis, the original downtown St. Louis, which no longer exists, St. Louis, Missouri, and how public art was used as a tool to address what many in St. Louis City Hall saw as a problem in their historical Portlandia district, the oldest neighborhood in the city. Now, going back to Toronto, that city councillor had a theory of Toronto City, and not just in terms of what he wanted and didn't want, but in terms of who counted among Torontonians, punkers, teenagers, and so on, who hung out there didn't really count as much as someone who was coming in from Etobicoke or Mississauga or living in a house, let's say, and so on. And so he had a theory. And I think that if you're a public artist, you have to have a theory of place, have a theory of the city. And I find it quite astounding that there's so much public art going on, but so little theorization of public art. And even less so, a consciousness of theorization of place among artists who deem themselves public artists. Now, theory can come in many forms. The cowboy motifs, the wild horses, the Stetson hat, the boots, cowboy boots, that's all kind of theory of the city, right? It's based on myth. It's based on, a kind of reified, imagined city that perhaps was tangentially true and may not be so much anymore. But it is a theory of the city. And we always have to, whether we agree with that myth or not, we have to attend to it. Among urban planners, they had many theories of the city. Richard Florida came up with one, the urban planning professor, smart cities. And that was about the idea of, well, how do we reinvigorate, especially cities that have went through decline and depopulation? How do we repopulate? How do we re-energize cities through creative neighborhoods, tax reduction in terms of abetting, especially the digital class of young creative minds, and so on. That's a kind of theory of the city. In the later parts of the 19th century, really the ill effects of over-urbanization and inattention to the welfare, especially of England's working class, there's a theory of the garden city movement. And the garden city movement was just to reconcile industry with residents and agriculture and nature. So that's a theory of the city, right? I'm not talking about whether it was successful or not successful, but there are all kinds of theories of cities among urban planners. In Calgary, blue sky city is a theory of the city, right? What does that theory tell me? It tells me that from the subject position of the people who in City Hall, I suppose, the official people who proposed blue sky city as the motto for the city, it tells me that they lack imagination and that banality is a lot safer than something that is more disjunctive. And my theory of that is, well, who doesn't like blue skies? It's universal, but it's also like the ether. It's far from the ground, right? We're going to stay as far away from the ground as possible. It'll be both universal and both meaningless, right? But the meaninglessness, paradoxically, is full of meaning, right? And it's also, I'm kind of projecting now since I don't know these people personally, but the meaninglessness also is a representation of fear of actually discussing real narratives, real events, real historical memories that are contested and that took place often through violence in a city like Calgary. So, and equally important is understanding what makes public art a public good. We can't just assume that, oh yes, public art, it's a good thing. Public art is also a bad thing. Public art could also be an instrument for all kinds of nasty politics, right? Public art is often used, for example, in cases of historical erasure when a building or site that has cultural significance is effaced, destroyed, and then something replaces it. And then the public art will use historical reconstruction to refer back to the thing that was lost, almost as if it's a kind of compensation. So, for example, that relates to the question of whose interest is served by public art. There's an idea that public art reflects a community's values, histories, and identity, but it's also important to consider who gets to define those values, who has a voice in representing the community, and who might be left out of that process. Public art functions today, by and large, as part of a bureaucratic administration managed by evaluators and review boards. So it's not just an ideal. For example, public art is often funded by public or private or both sources as required by public art mandates for development rights. Is that a good thing? What sort of compromises does that demand of not just our definition of public art, but also of the freedom of artists to express themselves for a particular site? So over the past several decades, practices in art in public space have evolved from a debated category within contemporary art to conceptually driven artistic practices that challenge the limitations of how art is created, shown, and shared. This change shifts focus from aesthetic considerations to social concerns, from object-centered to site-specific work, and from static forms to more dynamic, interactive processes or events. Nonetheless, ongoing global capitalism, the corporatization of culture, and the privatization of public space and dialogue threatens the role of art and its connection to publicness today. The goal of the public artist should be to revitalize public spaces by imagining them as places rich with multiple histories and voices, similar in many ways to Jürgen Habermas's idea of a true public sphere, where true public opinion could be formed. However, a space for genuine public opinion is often eroded by the administrative operations of public art itself. So the link between public art and social reality is increasingly weakened as public art becomes an ever important tool for civic bureaucracy, private development, or both. Too often, the value of public art is accepted simply because it is artful or entertaining, without considering the public role. So the idea... Is this working? Okay, sorry. So the idea of public art as a public good is often taken for granted, without clearly defining what a public good is, or who it benefits most. Is a public good a moral concern aimed at fostering a healthy social community, or is it a financial concern that redistributes private development funds for public use? After all, public art is frequently credited with stimulating a community's economic vitality. In truth, any answer to the fundamental question of whether public art is a public good is heavily influenced by society's deference to private property. So much for the notion that a public good is non-rivalrous and democratic in its aesthetic and symbolic use. A public good can, in fact, act as an opposite, a private good that favors certain consumers over others. So, let me just begin with something that I just added this before coming here. Something that recently happened to me because I was on a panel. It was a Zoom panel, so I wasn't actually in Vancouver. And it was about similar topic, and it involves the removal of the statue of King George VI, who was Queen Elizabeth's father, from the campus of the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. And I was on this virtual panel, and I shared the following points about the statue with people when I was asked what I thought about the removal of the King George VI statue. I said, it is the only full-figure representational sculpture among hundreds of works that fill the public and academic spaces at UBC, which I found quite astounding. The only full-figure statue. There are a couple of busts, but no full-figure statue. And regarding the royals, George VI was a rather sympathetic figure. He was shy, nervous about public speaking. I think some of you may have even seen the movie about the King's Speech, and had a noticeable stutter. He experienced poor health for much of his life. He was quite diminutive and he tired easily. Still, he was king throughout World War II, during which he was seen as a potent symbol of Great Britain and, by extension, the British Commonwealth. He also made several speeches criticizing South African apartheid and praising Canadian multiculturalism. Now, before I even shared my opinion on whether the statue should be removed, another panelist eagerly jumped in with intense indignation. I'm paraphrasing as best as I can, but it went something like this. Ken, don't you know he was a representative of colonial power? And this is an anti-racist opportunity to have this statue removed. Now, I didn't think this was fair, and I mentioned this incident because I think it's imperative to always have dialogue, polite dialogue, hopefully, and background information to vet the statue before and if it ever gets removed. Now, you'll notice that on the your right side, it says notice of art removal, and it gives the reason. It says the statue occupying this site will be removed to a interim storage site because they're redeveloping the entire area in front of this building. Right, but it had been here for well over half a century. Right, and so I also brought up the point. I said, well, why don't you announce that? Why don't I mean, you're removing it, but you're not giving the real reason why you're removing it. There's no dialogue about. In fact, it's being removed somewhat under stealth. It's not really a straightforward reason. It's like, oh, we're redeveloping it, so it has to be stored, right? But what they really wanted to do, and I objected to that, right? And there I got criticism again. You don't understand. People will be up in arms among especially reactionary types, and we don't want to engage with that. And I think if that's the case, I don't think that's interesting. I think you have to have dialogue, and you have to have engagement on a very wide level, including with those who disagree with you. So this segues to King George VI, a competition I was part of. I normally don't speak of my own work, but I thought I'm going to do it this time. That took place for the new King George VI station, a light rail transit station located on King George Boulevard in Surrey, near Vancouver. The boulevard was originally named King George Highway and it opened in 1940 in honor of King George VI's visit to Vancouver in 1939. The competition call referenced King George's name multiple times. So I proposed. I'm jumping ahead of myself. I proposed a bronze equestrian statue of King George inspired by similar royal statues like Toronto's King Edward VII. And I envisioned its base. I envisioned it based on a photo of a 2-year-old King George on a rocking horse. And after my presentation, two of the artists, and this is going back to the evaluation process for the competition, it's not at UBC. After my presentation, two of the artists, jurors on the evaluation committee, voiced their strong indignation with my proposal, essentially echoing what my fellow panelists told me years later at UBC. Ken, don't you know that King George is a symbol of British colonialism and everything that represents, said one juror. And the other juror said, you can't have a representation of King George for this King George competition. I want to just go back to regarding this, the King Edward VII statue in Toronto. There's a fascinating history behind its arrival in Toronto. I wrote about it in an essay and how it reflects power structures after discovering a plaque at the base during a visit. Oops, that was my proposal that was rejected. Oh, so I mean, that's King George. Oops. So I have to go back here. I thought maybe it's on sequence. Okay. Anyways, you see the plaques there. So equestrian statue of one of the plaques reads this way: equestrian statue of King Edward VII, originally standing in Edward Park, Delhi, India. This statue was erected to its present site through the generous donations of the citizens of this area, Toronto. This gift to the city of Toronto was made possible by the government of India and the former Canadian High Commissioner to India, His Excellency, the Right Honorable Roland Michener, Governor General of Canada, and brought to the city through the personal generosity of Henry Jackman, who's one of the big business people in Toronto. Signed May 24, 1969, William Dennison, Mayor. So this is what I wrote. The statue of King Edward VII was removed from India as part of a process of getting rid of reminders of the days of British rule in India after decolonization. After Indian independence, they didn't want these reminders of their rulers. And yet, in 1969, during a time of significant global political upheaval, as the world decolonized from various European powers after World War II, Canada wanted this statue. The Edward VII statue was moved at great expense from Delhi to India, funded by Henry Jackman, CEO of the Empire Life Insurance Company of Canada. It arrived in late 1968, but was only publicly acknowledged in early 1969, when Toronto's Mayor William Dennison accepted it as a donation for the Parks and Recreation Committee without public consultation. The mayor approved placing it in front of the grounds of Queen's Park. If you know Toronto, that's the legislature building and the most important park in public space in Toronto. The secretive decision likely avoided controversy among Toronto's British expatriates, while other non-British descent and darker-skinned residents surely understood their place. In 1914, 3 years after the Edward VII statue was dedicated to Delhi, almost 400 Punjab passengers aboard the Japanese steamship Komagata Maru sailed from Hong Kong to Vancouver. As British subjects, they believed their passports granted the right to travel and emigrate within the empire. An armed Canadian, you should know that that was actually stated as, if you have a British Empire passport, you could travel anywhere. They just never imagined that people who were put down would actually want to travel at some point. As British subjects, an armed Canadian Navy ship met the Komagata Maru, which anchored in Vancouver from May 23 to July 23, 1914, and only 20 remaining immigrants and a few others were allowed to disembark. The ship was forced to return to India via Kolkata, and within hours, British Indian police killed 20 of its over 300 passengers. So this is the memorial. What I'm trying to do is say how complex public art is and how unpredictable its web. But understanding public art's backstory, I'm just giving you a very specific example, is essential, as it provides opportunities to explore the connections between truth and power. Oh, here it is. So this is the plaque. See. By the way, Australia also took a lot of the statues of Queen Victoria, for example, sits in front of a very public space in downtown Sydney, Melbourne as well. And it reveals something of the privilege hierarchy of the former British Empire between white colonies or dominions and non-white colonized areas such as Jamaica and Kenya. So, let's look at the Duke of Wellington statue in Glasgow, Scotland. Erected in 1844 during Queen Victoria's reign and shortly after the Victoria's first phase of the British Empire's so-called Opium War against China, the statue has been topped with traffic cones since the early 1980s. Although the city of Glasgow removed the cones many times at great expense by hiring specialized cherry pickers because the base is very high, they were always replaced quickly by more cones. So in 2013, after multiple unsuccessful attempts to prevent people from placing cones on it, Glasgow proposed an expensive plan to double the height of the plinth. But widespread public opposition led to the local government abandoning this idea. And now currently, the statue with its cone appears in local tourist brochures and is promoted. And the renowned artist Banksy has declared it the best public sculpture in the UK. So it's like this. And one of the things that's interesting about this is, and again, it's a bit of a cautionary tale in terms of just a reflexive action to remove a statue. If it was gone, you wouldn't have this kind of action, right? Which is an ongoing protest with a very special, Scottish humor that reveals something of the relationship of truth to power of the Scots to the English. And so here's a picture of a cherry picker removing it. And when they proposed the plinth to be double in height, the cone pandemic, you might say, started a populist movement, and it started spreading to other statues throughout Glasgow, Edinburgh, Aberdeen, and into the Midlands and even London itself. And I think that's David Hume on the right, which is in Edinburgh. So, I could have picked many other different examples, but these are the ones I felt like speaking about. So this work here is titled Monument to Joe Louis. And it generated enormous controversy at the time of its unveiling in 1986. First, there was a public campaign co-sponsored by Sports Illustrated magazine as a gift to the city of Detroit, in which the artist Robert Graham worked in secrecy during the conception and production. The work was then covered with a large tent before its official unveiling, with the expectation of a widespread, positive public response. Instead, in front of a crowd of several thousand, once unveiled, the response was largely negative, and significant controversy immediately followed. And here are the reasons why the public, by and large, liked it. Not reasons that I necessarily agree with, but ideas that I discern as why they disliked it. Many African Americans, because Detroit is an African American city, thought, well, if historical white figures, especially white men, can be memorialized in full figure likeness, why can't a great historical figure like Joe Louis, who's Black, be as well? That's a good point. The sculpture focuses on Louis's right fist, the one he used to strike down opponents in the boxing ring. Therefore, the piece underscores Louis's deadly violence and the racist belief that Black men are inherently violent. The sculpture emphasizes the violence inflicted on Black bodies. It is incomplete, like a piece of a larger whole, like an amputation. Many Black bodies have lost limbs and lives due to the brutality of racism and slavery. The arm and fist are violently enclosed by a medieval pyramidal structure, evoking the shackling of Black bodies, like a wild animal that must be restrained. Lastly, the closed fist is a symbol that is linked to the history of Black resistance against oppression. not just that, but also linked to leftist politics, socialist politics. But over time, and the work was almost taken down several times, over time, public reception of the work started to turn. And that's another lesson of public art. We can't just measure it by the immediate response. Sometimes it takes time for the meaning of a work to be appreciated. It grew more popular, and it is now seen to speak truth to power about the relationship of Blackness to American society. It speaks truth to power about persistent racism and the struggle to be free. And it is a work that is embraced by Detroiters today. So and I should say, Joe Louis was this is all part of the backstory of that piece, because I teach a course on public art at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, and we always talk about this, right? In order to make the statue as it is more resonant for the purpose of my class, we have to understand that Louis was champion, and that he had to be part of this, not fiction, this construction of a family man, just like heteronormative white family man, the husband, the breadwinner, and so on. And he loved to golf all the better because it's a white man's, at that time, certainly white man's sport. And these are all parts of the things that made him, he had to negotiate as a black man who grew up poor and in a incredibly violent spectacle sport of boxing. And of course, he was enlisted in the military during the Second World War. He didn't have to really go, but he campaigned on behalf of Uncle Sam, recruitment, and so on. And if you're in my class, I would extend it backwards to Johnson, who's the who fought in at the early part of the 20th century. He was the world champion, and he was, and there was this whole motif of the great white hope. What great white man will beat this black guy, right? And he also had to negotiate things, and he violated certain expectations among the white audience, which was even more dominant at the early part of the 20th century than by the time of Joe Louis, because he married a white woman, for example. And then I would also move it the other way to Muhammad Ali and his protests against the Vietnam War and refusal to serve. All of this is part of the meaning of the monument to Joe Louis. So, of course, the Joe Louis work has this relationship to slave shackles, or to this. And this 1968 Detroit, heavy policing. Even though I think the sculpture is a fantastic work of art that speaks truth to power about the real relations of black bodies to America, there was still always a sense of dissatisfaction among many that there was not a full figure representation of Joe Louis. And so now, in more recent years, they opened, I think it was opened in 2024 in the convention center. Finally, there's a statue. But I don't think this statue, it could be in dialogue with the monument to Joe Louis, but I don't think this statue on its own would create much conversation, unlike the other work. So I want to bring it back to Canada, to Winnipeg specifically, and draw out the parallels between what you just saw in terms of Joe Louis Monument and the statue for Louis Riel. This is not the original statue for Louis Riel in front of the legislature building in Winnipeg. If you know anything about Louis Riel's life, you'll recognize that Canadian historians now depict him heroically, a portrayal long used and known by Métis and Aboriginal peoples and Indigenous peoples. In other words, the dominant narrative about Riel today is a rehabilitated one, not the tortured one in which he lived his life, and certainly not the tortured one that was still very much alive in 1971 when the original Louis Riel sculpture was put up, a work that tried to, that was removed. I should also say the work that was, maybe I should show you sorry. So this is the original one in 1971, and it lasted for many decades and until it was removed. Additionally, I think it's worth noting that the location for this work was also an important cruising site for gay men because they had these two fans, which makes the original Riel statue, in my estimation, way more interesting. It was a site for other peoples to frolic, to enjoy themselves, to engage in public practice. I call it public practice. But there were so many protests against this version that it was removed, and now it sits in the College of St. Boniface across the river, which is, as you may know, the traditional Franco-Manitoban. Now it's a neighborhood, but at one time a separate city from Winnipeg. I'm kind of wondering whether you prefer the new one or the old one. I think this is way more interesting. Okay, let's look at the Gateway Arch of St. Oh, there, see, it's kind of amazing work. Totally expressive. I'm interested in expression, and I'm interested in works that speak truth to power. Because when you speak truth to power, it means that the conversation around it will not ever go away until that relationship of truth to power is reconciled. Okay, let's look at the Gateway Arch of St. Louis, designed by celebrated Finnish architect Eero Saarinen, and opened in 1967 as a monument to the westward expansion of the United States. So this work here, which the Mississippi is at the very bottom left. And if you were astute, you'd think, well, wait a second, if St. Louis is settled on the Mississippi, why does the city start like around 20 blocks back? That's because the original part of St. Louis was erased to build this monument. And I think it's incredibly ethereal, beautiful monument. I think of it almost like it's a monument, ironically, that looks like a tombstone that casts a kind of shadow over the destroyed citizens who lived in this area. And so this is the oldest part of St. Louis. They did this, and city burghers wanted a monument because they saw this area a little bit like the Toronto councillor who said, nobody wants to go down to Yonge Street, right? And so we need to clean up this area, right? There's actually a administrative word or term for this, and it's happened in many, many cities. Vancouver with Hogan's Alley, with the Georgia Viaduct, which was supposed to slice even more of Chinatown apart. It's called urban renewal. Urban renewal is always used as a term, as a kind of excuse, because urban renewal always sounds great. We're renewing, right? But it's always targeted racially. Right? So people said, the burghers said, nobody's down there. 8,000 people lived there, and it was very lively. And they'd say, well, the people down there are unhygienic. They eat funny food. They don't speak good English, whatever, right? And it happened to be the largest African-American neighborhood and the largest Chinese American neighborhood at that time in the 1920s. So it had to go. So they built this. It's like seen as a celebration. See how public art is kind of always interesting once you start looking behind the curtain. And ironically, maybe not ironically, but tragically, the reason why St. Louis is sited where it is along the Mississippi is because the Cahokian people used to build these gigantic mounds of dirt. It took them hundreds of years to build up. And this was called the Big Mound of St. Louis. And when the Laclede brothers came up from New Orleans and said, where should we settle, and found St. Louis, they went right here, this big mound. This is perfect. It's almost like a sign from God. And then eventually they said, well, we need to take down this big mound. And it took years to take down, actually, because St. Louis was very small at that time, and they only did it by horse and cart. And then it became like this. And I've often thought that if there was a chance to do a public memorial to what was lost of the big mound, this shape like this would be perfect as a public art proposal. But they took away this as well. And the only instance of the big mound that you see in St. Louis is now this. This is terrible, but this also speaks truth to power. I want to look, finally, this is my final example before giving you my 10 secret ingredients to success in the world of public art. Finally, let's take a look at another example of public art. For many decades, an untitled memorial to Chief Tecumseh, made of twigs, twines, and ribbons, have been anonymously placed, removed, and replaced repeatedly at the base of the large General Brock's Memorial in Queenston Heights near Niagara Falls, Ontario. Major General Sir Isaac Brock stands atop a large limestone column facing the site of the Battle of Queenston Heights, which is part of the Battle of 1812. So you see the general there who's killed in battle. But his indispensable ally, Chief Tecumseh, is not officially acknowledged. And Brock, when he was dying from his wound, exhorted the people around him, don't forget Chief Tecumseh. But of course, as soon as he died, there was already a lot of conversation about a monument to General Brock, and Chief Tecumseh suddenly disappeared in terms of memory. And so this at the bottom left, this anonymously built makeshift character and modest scale has been euphemistically or colloquially called the Monument to Chief Tecumseh. It's not an official title, it's just what people who's interested in public art refer to it. And somewhat ironically, it emotionally overshadows Brock's monument, speaking truth to power about Canada's troubling relationship with its First Nations and Indigenous peoples in ways that most Canadians overlook. So that's my examples, and I could have shown you more, but I wanted to, because I know there's a lot of artists here, or at least I assume to be, I wanted to also read out some of these 10 pointers for public art. And I hope you'll draw parallels between that and what I've been trying to show you in terms of this earlier phase of my keynote. So all socio-political and economic activities occur, and that's demonstrated by these examples, within a spatial context. However, it's important to understand space in various ways, and depending on the theoretical framework and discipline, spaces can be defined semiotically and as a material interaction that operates across different agencies: media, public space, social sphere, ecology, financial networks, and more. And if you're interested in public art, you need to have some degree of command over all these domains. I call them discursive domains. So here are the 10 rules. And again, these are rules that works for me. It's not a prescription, but I'm offering to you anyways. 1, imagining a public involves considering the audience created by the space. Because it's important to think of your work as not just for an anticipated audience, but that audience is shaped and produced by your work. The concept of the public is complex and layered, even in spaces that may seem bland and uniform. Despite this, we still need to think about the public. The artist must actively negotiate what that definition of a public is. That's the first thing. Number 2, imagining a space, especially within the context of a potential community social area. Space in urban environments today is characterized not only by economic and political occupation, but also by corresponding cultural code that reinforces those economic and political frameworks. It's self-serving, it's reifying. The distribution of power, the hierarchy of power that's in place in society needs to have everything from political to cultural to economic to social domains and discourse reaffirm the truth of the dominant regime. Okay? When I say truth, it's in quotations. So recognizing that every space has rules and unspoken laws regarding what can and cannot be said or done at any given time is crucial. Number 3, consider the site in which the work will go as a conduit and as a node of embodiment for artistic experience, as well as a potential narrative for disenfranchised histories and voices that physically shape its social fabric. Number 4, reflect upon history, especially marginalized histories, as they are experienced in social and public spheres, both now and in the past. And when I say this, it's not like it should not be seen as a chore. Marginalized histories make history really interesting. That's the most compelling aspects of history. The kind of subjugated knowledges of oppressed peoples, of oppressed communities, of erasure by official forces. That's what makes it so interesting and live and vital. Additionally, consider how the marginalization of history itself has changed over time. So history changes, but then the way it's marginalized also changes over time. In our history, we would call that historicity, the interest in the changes within history. Number 5, consider mediation, I should say. Mediation involves stakeholders with a vested interest in the project, in your idea or proposal. These stakeholders often hold conflicting or overlapping interests. For example, city public art initiatives often aim to uphold heritage and identity, sometimes ironically, by creating art that reconstructs history because the original elements and values of that history have been torn down. Telling untold stories has become a common theme in public art. That's true. However, even these stories must be presented carefully, preserving aspects of what remains unspoken, especially what still cannot be said. Number 6, learn from non-art. Public art visually competes with many engaging non-art expressions. Observe how non-art surfaces often attract attention effectively. Also note that art is expected to resemble increasingly non-art forms of entertainment or distraction by avoiding the conditions of discomfort, which can differentiate meaningful public art from non-art displays. Number 7, imagine public art without administrative purpose. That is, art that can transcend institutional boundaries and reconnect with the sacred. It ties public art to everyday space by doing so. Everyday space, time, experience, and ritual. Viewing public art as sacred, I don't mean religious, but sacred in the spiritual sense, introduces the idea of public movement as pilgrimage, a negotiation between the sacred and the ordinary. Public art exists in the everyday, if we think of the sacred in these terms. Public art exists on the way to work in a truly public sense. Number 8, think of public art as a disjunctive force within the semantic field at play for the site. Consider public art as an indeterminate term that refuses to be fully claimed, which interacts with the heterotopias of the space and the various fleeting utopias within it. Public art is something that should be shared across time and space, inherently involving the sharing of anxieties, public anxieties. Number 9, consider the concept of absence, that is, what is not present at the prevailing site or in the broader social context, what has been erased. This can include ideas of transitional or counter monuments, even those that negate themselves. It also addresses the notion of imagined communities composed of whole or fused individuals, as well as the idea of a self that is doubly constructed, both through its presence and absence within the community, not merely through perceived participation. That public art should exist in your memory, even when you're not in front of that work. Lastly, number 10, view public art as a catalyst that awakens memory and stirs the imagination. So, to close, the French sociologist Henri Lefebvre asserted that space is a construct derived from the human body, referring to this as spatial practice. And resistance is initiated through the bodily or corporeal capacity to generate space, which serves as a means for individuals to reclaim agency in their daily lives. Art holds significance as it is a practice capable of establishing a space liberated from the hegemony of a culture driven by exchange value. This is how I believe that public art must act, to respond as a subversive force to the spatial disruption of our times, or what the English sociologist Doreen Massey referred to as the persistent attempts by hegemonic power to sanitize and sentimentalize specific heritages. That goes on in Calgary all the time with the settler and kind of foothills motifs. For example, Confederate monuments and statues were monuments to the mostly men who created crimes against humanity related to First Nations and Aboriginal people. They serve as examples of a sanitization of heritages. They convey an idealized notion of a time past when places were supposedly characterized by coherence and unified communities. Such false notions should not diminish the authentic longing many have for community. This longing highlights the deep divisions that fracture our supposedly unified experience of space and place. Public art can and must contribute to the idea of taking back the city and regenerating public life. As all public art is in dialogue with all other public art symbols and edifices of the city, public art should aim to connect neighborhoods across the city, including bridging its many racial, social, economic, and identity divides. Thanks very much.